It's always kind of interesting to just sit and sometimes think right into the camera here for a minute before I start. I usually try to ask for guidance that I might be able to say something that's meaningful and that will help you and those you love, others that you may not even know, because of understanding that you have maybe through watching some of these and referencing some of the things that I reference. Life is kind of an amazing thing, and as you live it, you come to realize that everybody has a different course that they take, and yet there's commonalities in all of them as you read and study and observe. One of the greatest commonalities is that life experiences are designed for not just a purpose, but purposes. First and foremost, maybe those life experiences are designed for you, but they might also be designed for you to experience so that you can help somebody else. And I believe that that's the case also. I think that if I didn't really believe that, I wouldn't be doing these videos like I'm doing them. I've become aware of something lately that it's not really a new thing, but it keeps getting re-emphasized to me, and that is that we live in a society that is just filled with noise, chatter, distractions, to the point that it almost becomes an addiction. If we don't have that distraction, that noise going on, we feel like we're in a place we shouldn't be, when in reality, we should avoid the distractions and the noise to the point where it's that peace and quiet that we feel, and the lack of things to make us look elsewhere or hear something else or whatever. It's just the noise of the world. I think you maybe know what I'm talking about. I could give you lots of examples, but a lot of it comes through the media. I think that, especially my observation lately since the invention of the cell phones, and earlier it was the invention of television, and I suppose even before that, radio, and music is a wonderful thing. I enjoy music, but I enjoy best the kinds of music that lets my mind, kind of launches my mind rather than curtails it or pulls it in one direction. I don't really like music with a beat necessarily. I would prefer just a soft, mellow background type of music. I realize that's just me, but I think that there's something there that everybody needs to lean into, and that's more alone time, more quiet time, more wherever you spend it, whether it's out on the deck by yourself, or whether it's maybe even driving in a car in a place where the driving's not too intense. You don't have to get distracted with driving. I found myself sometimes being able to think, quite clearly, just driving alone in the car, leaving the radio off, and just letting my mind go here and there. with some thoughts. And I think at the center of those thoughts, again, you have to ask some basic questions. They're the kinds of questions that you would ask if there were no distractions at all. If you were just laying down on the grass somewhere and it was totally quiet and it was nighttime and you were looking up at the stars and you could see all those stars. Holy cow. And now they're finding out that galaxies are as prevalent as we once thought stars were. And they're just everywhere. And you lay down on that grass and you look up into the sky and you start to ask yourself just some fundamental questions like, number one, who am I? And number two, how do I fit in the mix of all of that I'm looking at? What's all of that for? What am I for? Who am I? Why do I exist? What's my purpose? Where did I come from? Just how did you get here? You. How did you get here and where did you come from? And why are you here? Why am I here? What's the purpose of that existence? Where will I go? What will become of me? What will become of you? Can you make sense of it all? Can you figure out the purpose for your existence? Where you're going? How you're going to get there? What you'll do when you're there? And if you're like most people, you'll just say, it doesn't matter, just live life a day at a time, see what happens. Well, that's one way to approach it, I guess. But I have found that in just about everything I do, if there's some planning that goes into it and some foresight, I guess it's because of my upbringing on the farm and observing my father, for example, and my mother too, as she helped him. But he could sense what that earth was for, and he knew that it would grow seeds. And if he planted at the right time, and he took care of the seeds, and he arranged to get water there somehow, and then just said his prayers and prayed for sunlight and warmth, that those seeds would grow, and he could find out what kinds of seeds worked the best, which ones didn't work so well. And eventually he could make enough to pay off that little 112-acre farm that he had in only 5 years, when most people said it would have taken a lifetime or much, much longer. But he was determined. Well, he didn't accomplish that by just letting life come at him a day at a time. Even though I guess you could say that's the way it comes to everybody. Yes, but think of how much of thought that he gave that, how much anticipation, how much information was necessary to be gathered to know what to plant and when and where, how to water, how to make it all profitable so that it would benefit somebody. And I think the analysis of our lives requires us to think about some of those same questions. I've thought a lot about some of those questions because I don't know how you go through life without trying to figure out who you are and what you're for, how you get where you're going. And realizing that what you see in the mirror is not you. That's stuff that came out of the ground. That the real you is your spirit entity. That may resemble that person in the mirror, but that person in the mirror is not made up of you. Well, once you grasp that, then you start thinking, then it becomes a spiritual trip. And you start to realize that you need to understand things on a different level than you do just the temporal things, the physical things. Though there's lots of similarities, and I think that's by design. There's lots of similarities that show us that the physical things have spiritual counterparts. Now, you've heard me talk about Thoreau, and as soon as I say the spiritual counterparts, the real us, I can't help but think of a term that he used. He would call, when he would observe nature, and he would observe it very carefully without a lot of the noise. He loved to be alone and let nature come to him and think about it and see if he couldn't learn what it had to teach him. And then he would work to find what he called a fabulous reality. And what a fabulous reality was something that you could observe in your natural surroundings, maybe even with your own body. But if not, your natural surroundings, the pulse of nature, the ebbs and flows. Start thinking about where those ebbs and flows exist. It's not just in tides. There's ebbs and flows in all kinds of things about us and in the things that we're around in nature and animals' lives and plants' lives and even the heavens, sunrises and sunsets, spring leaves and fall leaves. There's an ebb and flow and a cycle to things. Well, Thoreau termed these things fabulous realities. Fabulous realities. And he would observe those things in nature that he could see. Once he started thinking about it, he could see a physical, a temporal application to our lives, to our spirits, to us. That those things in nature that he observed carefully would teach him. And I've talked about a few of them. The sun marching across the horizon, for example, stopping at a given point. In the fall solstice, September, 21st? And then coming back the other way. Till it reached the spring solstice. And then there's the summer and the fall, the winter, all of that mixed in there. But there's a plan to it all, and there's a justice to it all. There's a fairness, if I can say it that way. the cold parts of the earth get an extra abundance of warmth if they're just patient and hang on, kind of like us. When things aren't going so good, and if we're just patient and we hang on, pretty soon, if you have any hindsight, the ability to look behind you and observe things from afar off, you start to realize that it was fair. It wasn't so unfair after all. It seems unfair at the time when you're not getting the sunlight. It's cold. Then when the warmth comes back and the sunlight comes back, you're able to do twice as much with the same amount of time. Then you start to realize that, yeah, there is a fairness about things. Well, that's what Thoreau would call a fabulous reality. Observing something in nature and saying, that has an application to my spiritual entity as well. When I was teaching in the junior high school, we would talk about some of these kinds of things in literature and write about some of them. And then I talked my principal into letting me take the kids in the spring of the year, and he'd always wait for a nice warm spring day, or at least arrange it so that we'd be in that time of the year, about the dandelion time of the year, I call it, when things are warming up and you're just anxious to get outside anyway. I told her, I said once, I'd like to take the students and go for a walk up in the hills. And at first when I asked her that, she says, well, is there any kind of instructional value that's going to come out of that? I can't really just say, yeah, go walk with the kids. Well, I had some instructional value in mind, and I told her what it was. And I told her, I said, I'm going to have them do a writing assignment. But the writing assignment that I'm going to have them do is I'm going to set them up so that they can go out into nature and up in the hills with me. Try not to speak too much, though they could enjoy each other's company, but there would be quiet times when we just sit and observe and walk quietly, maybe off on our own a little bit. Think about things, observe things. Spring's a great time of year to do all that because there's so much happening, coming back to life. So I do that. I had a little cabin up in the hills where I'd take them, and we'd kind of make it fun by stopping into the cabin. And I'd tell them to bring a sack lunch, and so they had a sack lunch, and we'd sit in there and talk. I'd sometimes tell them a yarn. I had an old mountain man picture in there that my mother-in-law drew me because I really liked the hat on it. It had a skunk skin hat. In fact, I've had one made up by my brother-in-law, and I won't tell you some of the things I've used it for to kind of play pranks on people, but I used to sit there with the kids and I'd tell them stories. I mean, quote, stories. Yarns, maybe is the better word to say it. And I always used to like to see how far I could stretch it out before they'd actually figure it out. And I had some pretty good props up there because I'd found some old Rambouillet. They used to run sheep up there, and Rambouillet sheep the bucks have pretty curly horns, almost like wild sheep that you'd find in the mountains and the rocky cliffs. And I found a whole skull with one of those attached. I had it there in the cabin. And I'd usually create some sort of a wild story about it. Sometimes it varied, but it was always fun to kind of string the kids along. Made me think of Mark Twain. He wrote a couple of stories where he'd string you along. I think I've mentioned maybe Jim Blaine and his grandfather's ram from Roughing It. If you haven't read that, read it. He talks about an old boy that used to string people along with his storytelling. And then he wrote another one called Cannibalism in the Cars. And I used to like to read that to the kids, because if you read it just right, you could make believers out of them. And Mark Twain was actually just leading you along all the time. But if you read it just right, you could pretty much get their eyes opening wider and wider as you read that story. It's about some people that got trapped in a train in a snowdrift for a long period of time. Well, I won't get into that. But observing and enjoying nature was what we did on that trip. We'd eat the lunch there at the cabin. I'd tell them some yarns, and then I'd usually come clean afterwards and make sure that they didn't think I was a big liar kind of person. I always figured it was important for people to be able to figure out whether you was lying or whether you wasn't, and justify it some way. But we had fun. And then the students would observe things as we went back and do the same things. They'd look for wasps' nests in the trees and birds' nests, and just even bark on a brush or tree or moss or leaves, different kinds of rocks and the way they formed, how they had different colorations. There's all kinds of things that you can observe in nature that if you observe them really carefully, you can learn a lot. I think I may have told you about Thoreau. It was noted, in fact, he recorded some time that he spent looking under the leaves on the forest floor. And people would see him there in the morning, and he'd be there at night still looking, and he'd tell what it was about, and he was looking at a battle going on between some red ants and some black ants. And he observed the battle all day long. Different strategies that they use, how they'd help each other, what they'd do with the dead, what the wounded would do, how they'd take care of the wounded. And I've often thought, it's too bad some of these people that like to fight, like right now, Russia and Ukraine are fighting. And there's been hundreds of thousands of people get killed. Wouldn't it be great if the leaders of that country could have gone off in their backyard, seen the red ants and the black ants fighting, see what came out of the whole thing, took some truths that they learned from that observation and applied it to their own lives, and let all those hundreds of thousands of soldiers live, and all those buildings that got annihilated continue to stand and provide livelihoods. It's just a shame that we have to learn truth the hard way sometimes, when there's an easier way if we just embrace it. Know truth intuitively and apply it. Transcendental thinking. You've heard me talk about it. Well, I was actually going to talk about a little something more this time, but I think I'll stop there for now. Let this little fabulous reality lesson, I guess we'll call it, because that's what Thoreau called it, a fabulous reality. That's what I called it to the kids. That was their fabulous reality assignment. And they had some good things when they would come back. I'd give them 2 or 3 days to collect their thoughts and their notes, their remembrances, and then try to apply it to some aspect of life and see if it couldn't teach them something they needed to know without actually maybe experiencing it all out, like the ants fighting in the leaves. If they couldn't learn the futility of battling, just like those ants did, then people wouldn't have to battle. There wouldn't have to be contention. Nature is meant to be a harmonious thing, even though there's ebbs and flows and everything. There's a harmony that radiates, and there's a thread that runs through it that speaks peace and fairness and goodness and joy to the soul at different times of the year, more than others, depending on what our likes and dislikes are. So go find yourself some fabulous realities. It doesn't take a lot. Observe a caterpillar really up close, or a moth, or a butterfly, or a leaf, or an ant, or a twig, or a rock, or something growing in the garden. And if you want to branch off just a little bit, observe people. We're all part of it. Observe people. See what you can learn from them. If you ever pass somebody on the sidewalk and they have smile lines in their face and they give you a smile almost instinctively as you walk by them, other people have a kind of a grouchy appearance, and you couldn't get a smile out of them. Have you ever asked yourself, I wonder why? What would be the difference in those two people? Their backgrounds, their experiences. Which one would I like to be around the most? And which kind am I? You can't think about all these things with chatter going on and noise, blaring music and television and ball games, sirens, and all of the sounds that come with civilization. And there's places you can go to get away from it. You can learn a lot just by watching the way a stream flows. And if you watch how the little fish seem to swim in certain parts of the stream more than others, you can learn from that too. I won't get into everything, but there's lots of fabulous realities around us, and they are fabulous, and they're there for a reason. God placed fabulous realities all around us so that we could gain insights into how we could apply those truths that we learn from the things we observe into our own lives, so that we don't have to go through the misery that we might otherwise have to go through. Fabulous truths applied, fabulous realities. Go find some and see if they can't give you some peace and love and relaxation, and clear some other stuff out of your head, and let you know that God cares about you. He loves you. I love you. Good night.